Welcome to Blurring the Boundaries, a research conversation about doing research online. The participants in today's conversation are Luke Sloan and Janet Salmons. Let's meet them. Luke Sloan is Director of Learning and Teaching at Cardiff University, where he's chair of the University Survey Management Group, which has oversight of all institutional surveys. He's the Deputy Director of the Social Data Science Lab, and his research includes work on understanding who uses Twitter through the development of demographic proxies and data linkage. Find recent articles by Luke and about Luke at MethodSpace. Free-range scholar Janet Salmons is the methods guru for MethodSpace and the author of a number of books about online research, online learning, and collaboration. Watch for the forthcoming second edition of her Doing Qualitative Research Online. My name is Michael Todd with Sage Publishing, and I'll be back later to feed your questions to Janet and Luke. Feel free to post those questions at any time during this hour-long event on the Q&A box, although the Q&A portion of the event will be in the second half. And this webinar will be recorded and archived at methodspace.com. So with that, let's turn it over to Janet for today's agenda.
All right, thank you, Michael. And so what we would like to do today is have a little bit of a different approach than you may have experienced with some webinars, because we really want to have a conversation. And then we welcome your questions and comments, and we will try to then follow up with some of those that we don't have time to talk about in subsequent posts. So in thinking about planning this webinar today, I was, kind of thinking back to early days when we were just starting to think about how to do research online, the ethics and practices and methodologies and methods. And I met Luke Sloan through a project called New Social Media, New Social Science, where we were really, just exploring those questions. And the subheading of that was blurring the boundaries, trying to bring together qualitative and quantitative independent academic social researchers. And so I thought that it would be fun to follow up on that project. And I should mention that NSS, the longest possible acronym, project was co-sponsored by SAGE and the NatCen, National Center for Social Research in the UK. So, in thinking, from then till now, what have we been working on? What are we still trying to think through and find, ways to move forward and to kind of, really have an exchange of ideas. And I'm welcoming Luke's input on my work, and he's willing to take some input from me on his work and have a friendly dialogue. So Luke, why don't you start by just kind of giving a little bit of an overview about what you've been working on.
Sure, thanks, Janet. Thanks for the awesome introduction. I'm really glad to be here. I'm just looking at the number of people on this call. This is amazing. I wish my lecturers were this well attended. So hi, everybody. Good to see you all. So straight to the point, what are my interests? Well, I'm a broad brush social scientist with an interest in methods. That's sort of how I came into academia, and I've always been interested in methods. And I guess during my formative years as a new lecturer is when social media came on the rise, and I saw an opportunity. And at this very basic level, I'm interested in knowing what social media can tell us about the social world. So I'm not really making any assumptions about its validity or who's on there. I think all those questions are up for grabs. So it's a question about what can it tell us and what's its utility? Who's represented, who's absent? There was quite a lot of talk when social media was on the ascendancy about this idea that it democratizes voice, that it gives a voice to people who were previously unheard in social research because of existing power relations. Is that really the case? Has that actually happened? It's an interesting question. Do the inequalities that we see existing every day in the world of work or based on gender, race, ethnicity, age, do they still manifest on social media? Is there a difference between what people tell us they do and what they actually do? So reported and observed behavior. I'm interested in all of these things. And I guess, if I'm honest, I come from a position that I think social media can tell us something, but I think there's quite a lot of work to be done to work out what exactly that is. Hence my focus and my interest really on linking survey and social media data to get some kind of correspondence, to kind of ground and link them to see if it is telling us something similar or something different and something new.
Well, of course, we communicate online all different ways, including social media, but not, limited to that. So, in my kind of research interests as a methodologist, I think that I kind of go from the premise that when we are choosing to use technology as, kind of a central part of the research design, it influences everything in the research design. And that, we need to think of the research design process as iterative and holistic, and that, we may find ourselves kind of circling back to some earlier stage because the choices we've made, have some, further implications. So the other models I'm going to share today are kind of a subset of this framework where I'm trying to show, some of the critical areas that we need to think about as online researchers. So we're going so what we're going to do today, we have 2 models from my work and 2 models from Luke's work, and we're going to just, talk about them, what we're trying to explain with these models, and kind of, how we might unpack them a little bit. So why don't you start with yours?
Yeah, thanks, Janet. I think it's really important to start conceptually with how social media differs to other traditional sources of data. Because I think if we don't really understand that, and this gets on to the stuff you talk about later about mediated communication, Janet, if we don't really understand that, then we don't really understand what the data is telling us or what its potential is. We also don't understand its strengths and weaknesses. So, we've had decades of dealing with surveys and focus groups and interviews, and this new source of data has come along in a very short space of time. We've embraced it, but it feels to me as though I kind of realized this with hindsight, looking back now, that our ability to access this data outpaced our methodological understanding. So now we're kind of taking a step back and thinking perhaps more carefully after the initial, I guess you might call it a gold rush of excitement around it. It doesn't mean it's not useful, it just means we can take a more considered approach. So let's think about some of the key differences between, let's take survey data, and I'm talking about social media in general here. I mean, my research is mainly on Twitter, but a lot of this applies to pretty much any platform. So fundamentally, surveys are about reported data. We're asking people to report on things. So historically, how many hours of television did you watch last night? Who did you vote for? How much have you spent on groceries in the past week? That kind of thing. Now, social media is different because we're not going directly to a respondent. We're actually able to observe the transactions they've had with the platform, the data traces they've generated, download them through an API. So they are actual like digital fossils of behavior that happened. It's very different to asking people. So if you were to ask someone, how many times did you tweet in the past month? It's a difficult question to answer, and you probably wouldn't get that accurate of data, but you could go and look at Twitter and find out absolutely for sure to know that. There's a lot of work in media studies, of course, about people's inability to accurately recall patterns of behavior. So there's an opportunity there to actually observe rather than just take reports at face value. I think there's also a question about the nature of the tool. So surveys can be quite artificial, and being artificial, it affects the data we collect, whereas data that happens in the social media environment is not collected for the purposes of research. So perhaps it has higher ecological validity, but we have to be aware that it doesn't spontaneously exist out of a wider technological, sociological context. If someone puts something on Twitter, it is a willful act to achieve something, either to communicate with someone, to reach out. It's not a random thing. So we've really got to think about what are people doing when they're producing this content. Survey data is obviously highly structured. And social media data, actually, technically, it is very structured. If you get like a JSON file through an API for Twitter, I mean, structure is what it's all about. But I mean, it's noisy in the sense that, you know, when we design a survey instrument, we're collecting data and operationalizing variables that help us answer a research question. Whereas with social media, we're kind of diving in to this mass of data, trying to find a signal in the noise. It's just a different way of doing things, different way of thinking about things. Something that some colleagues and I've been working on recently, and they've been leading on, is this idea about the amount of data generated, and that there are data asymmetries. So it's a hard one to explain, but, you know, if you ask 100 people to fill in a survey, you get responses from everyone for all the questions. Even if the data is missing, we have the same amount of data, the same number of variables. But on Twitter, we get these power laws where some people might tweet once a month and others might tweet several times a day. So there's massive variance. And what that means is that some people seem to have a louder voice through volume than others. And that matters when you're looking for things online. There are questions about representation. So in survey studies, we would typically either design them as probability studies, so they'd be representative, or we'd at least collect demographic information to work out who had responded. There's none of that on social media. It's really sparse. It can be done, but with differing levels of confidence. So we're not sure who is present, who is represented. So like I said at the start, this idea that it is somehow liberating and that people who are previously oppressed in some way have a new voice, well, maybe, but it can be quite hard to show that at a high aggregate level. And the final one comes from a paper that a colleague of mine led on, which is the idea that surveys are punctiform. So they take a snapshot of things at time. If it's a cross-sectional survey, then it might be one snapshot and that's it. Even if it's a longitudinal or a panel study going back year after year, you get a snapshot of things at any one time. Social media is constant, rolling, locomotive. You know, it'll capture things in between. So if you've got a longitudinal study and you ask whether someone's employed at time A and then employed again at time B, you might find the answer is both yes. If you had the social media data, you might realize they dropped out of employment partway through and then come back in. So, you know, is there an opportunity there for the locomotive nature of social media to tell us something new, something more nuanced, more with greater temporal granularity than a survey? That's the question. So, you know, conceptually, there's a lot going on there. There are lots of opportunities and lots of challenges too.
Right. Well, I can see how this could be, you know, very helpful for someone who is trying to decide, you know, for a particular study, you know, what part of it do I want that, you know, what I can get from social media, and you know, how can I use the survey to complement that? But, you know, looking at this model, the two questions that I had that I thought maybe you could explain a little bit more or think through is, you know, what are there other relationships between, say, you know, the blue column items and the orange column items, you know, for, you know, example, you know, in terms of structure, you know, might we, you know, if we say, well, you know, we want to be more focused and have less noise, than on social media, we're going to do that by following a particular hashtag or following particular influencers. So that might, you know, so, you know, the representation and the observed might, you know, tie in with the structure on that side. Or do we, you know, maybe look at, you know, that in some ways, depending on the social media platform, you know, you are getting that self-report that you have. So, you know, do you see other lines, you know, between these two columns than the ones that go across as you've illustrated?
Yeah, it's interesting, Janet. I mean, it makes me think about how we operationalize variables, because fundamentally, if you're going to link survey and social media data into a spreadsheet, you know, where each row is represents an individual respondent and each column is a variable, you need to get from this messiness of social media to some variable that can be recorded and coded in some way. So we just have to get there through a different process. So if I were interested in attitudes towards climate change, and I was asking that through a survey, I might ask an inventory of questions about, general awareness, concern or anxiety, sorts of behaviours people do to mitigate or not against climate change and environmental damage. You could try and operationalize those on Twitter, for instance, by looking at the sorts of words people use. You can use various sort of topic modeling and categorization tools to look for anxiety that's associated with tweets around certain topics. So you can use computational methods to almost kind of reverse engineer them into a variable. The question is, are the two the same? And is there correspondence? And the other question is that, and this is an interesting one, which one is the gold standard? So if I'm asking someone about, say, their recycling behavior, is there a social desirability effect when I'm asking them on a survey where they feel they need to answer in a way? And what's this kind of equivalent effect on social media? Are people performing to a particular character or ideal, which I think they are? And is it a pleasing one, or are they likely to be more honest about their opinions? I don't know. It's tricky.
Right. Well, also, I mean, it's interesting that the two that you've chosen, one involves directly interacting with participants, and the other is most likely not.
Yes.
And so, let's move on to one of mine. And so I work primarily in qualitative research where, there's not always interaction with participants, but a lot of times there is in qualitative research. So in thinking about the technology and kind of trying to categorize from what I've seen of the, from the literature, I came up with three kind of options. And in a given study, you might use more than one of these options together, but still thinking it through will help you decide, for one thing, what I call abbreviated ICT, what information communications technology you're going to use, because it could be internet, could be apps, other kinds of things. So in the first instance with the medium, I want to talk with you, but you're in Cardiff. So, we're going to have to communicate online. I don't care what technology we use. We can schedule a synchronous meeting on Skype or Zoom, or we can text message or send emails. I don't care what the medium is. I just want to be able to communicate with you. I'm going to choose what's most comfortable for you, which means in research, I may end up choosing different technologies for different participants because I'm using what they know how to use and what's accessible to them. In the next instance and setting, there are kind of two ways of thinking about this. One is that I have decided that, that just going with the pure medium is not enough. I really do need to see, I want it to be synchronous. I want to be able to see the person. I'm going to pick a technology that will provide a setting with the features that will allow me to collect the kind of data that I want, the kind of interaction I want to have. Or I could say, in terms of more of the observational, well, this is a group where people are discussing flex time or cancer survival or, whatever it may be, climate change. And so I'm going to pick this setting to observe because this is where the action is on the topic I'm studying. So then on the third one, the technology itself is part of the phenomenon. So with the others, I'm using the technology to conduct the study, but I'm not studying the technology. Whereas in the third one, that's what I'm studying. So, when you describe your research, you're partly trying to study whatever the topic is, but you're also, really looking critically at how people use these technologies, how they, their frequency, the features, etc. So I would put to you, did I miss anything with this? What would you add, or how do you think this might be helpful? This kind of questioning might be helpful to someone who is designing an online study.
I'm going to use this in my teaching from now on because it really crystallizes something that I've always found it a little difficult to explain. So, when you're saying, often I have conversations with people about research with social media, and they're using social media, for instance, to recruit to an online survey. So it's a convenient medium to tweet that out. But actually, the fact is, in Twitter doesn't matter, And then the setting things. So you're looking at discourse. So let's keep the climate change one if you want to talk about discourse around climate change. So you go on Reddit or something. But then when you get to things like bigger social networks like Twitter and Facebook, they have rules that the platform shapes the nature of debate, either through the way people are connected, or the systems of likes, or on Twitter, the limit on the amount you can say. Like, the technology doesn't just mediate, it's the architecture in which the discussion happens. I guess that's the point you're making.
Right. And so what, if you're choosing a technology, how are you going to either work with or work around those kinds of affordances?
Yeah.
And then, if you're thinking about interacting with someone, well, if it's important to me to see you, and so that I can get the nonverbals, I can get some sense of the timing of your response, what you have to really think about versus, it's right on the top of your head. I also might think, well, am I observing other things? Am I going to look in your environment? Are you going to ask me, well, what are those books on your shelf? Tell me about the diploma behind you. Is that important? If it is, then you need to tell your participant ahead of time, I would prefer that you'd not put on a virtual background. I want you to keep the camera on through the entire interview. Is that okay with you? So, there are negotiations around those things that, you would need to make if you're going to choose that. And then you have to say, well, what do you do if they turn the camera off in the middle of it? If that was part of, what was important to you with this. So I think it helps people think in terms of planning of what might go into sort of the consent negotiation and things like that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if you're doing an interview sort of pre-pandemic, assuming you would try and do it in person, physically, if you could, typically, and we could probably reflect on how important this particular framework is now, given the pandemic and the difficulties of moving around. It's become even more important. But you wouldn't, if you're doing a face-to-face interview with someone, you wouldn't set up a camera. You'd probably have a dictaphone and record it. Like, the visual and the audio are very different. And we see it kind of comes through in a lot of the literature on the ethics of accessing social media data, that people have differential concerns as to whether it's just their text or their images.
Right.
They're different things to people. They mean more. The images are much more invasive in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that's really interesting.
And I also think that, say, the ICTs as phenomenon, that, what we kind of would see as like internet studies and those kinds of things that for people who are interested really just in the communications medium, are frustrated by, looking at the internet studies and going, well, this isn't going to help me. But if you have this framework in mind, you can say, okay, I understand now that literature is not going to, be relevant to me. I need to look somewhere else. So let's move on to another one of yours. So tell us about this one.
So this is the big question, isn't it? I've had this question with quite a few colleagues, actually, that we shouldn't necessarily assume that linked data is greater than the sum of its parts, but it might be, and it's worth testing. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of interesting stuff around consent to link and what people will and won't let you link, and so on and so forth, which is a big package of work that I'm involved in with colleagues at the moment. But the fundamental point is, does it tell us something additional? Does it tell us something new? So the example I used earlier of say a longitudinal or a panel study, when you're going back every year, a separate wave, asking someone about, let's say employment again, that's a nice safe example. And we find they're employed at wave 1 and employed at wave 2. if we could link to their biography field on Twitter and see how they changed the way they describe themselves over the year, if we could link to any other social media platform, for instance, Facebook or LinkedIn or anything, you know, would this tell us something about their employment that we don't get through the survey? And there are two ways of looking at this. The first is that it fills in the gaps between the data collection waves. But of course, we can ask people retrospectively to account for things that have happened. So, you know, it's not as though surveys are incapable of assessing the past. The other thing social media does is when we ask surveys, we need to know what we want to know. But social media is kind of agnostic to what we want to know. So are there other things it can tell us that we don't even know that we can ask? You know, like the unknown unknowns in that sense. What else can it tell us?
It gives it sort of the serendipity, you know, aspect of it, where you might, using your employment example, you might find that on social media, what they're talking about is childcare or, something like that, that might not have been a topic that you decided to ask about in the survey, but here's the critical thing that, is part of their conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, going back to your previous framework, Janet, if we think of ICT as a phenomenon of interest, so Twitter is the phenomenon of interest, is it reasonable to expect the kind of things that you ask in a survey to manifest on the platform? Do those things naturally surface in the conversations people talk about?
Or how would you find those? That's, I mean, on one hand, I mean, like you say, you're talking specifically in this one about Twitter. I mean, in some of the other platforms where people congregate around groups where, you might have, a group of working parents who are talking about childcare, and, whereas on Twitter, if they're just talking about employment, they could be talking about, if you picked, specific hashtags to follow, you might miss those conversations, because I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer that you might look at childcare, but there may be something that you hadn't thought would be a determining factor for people in this situation that would come up. So there's kind of more of that sifting and kind of being open to kind of new directions that is not possible with the survey, especially when you're using a particular instrument that's been tested and everything, and is for rigor. So you can't just say, oh well, now we decided we want to ask this other question, because you've already gotten this survey approved.
Yes. I mean, I think you're right, and I think also so again, going back to your point about the phenomenon of interest, whether those things surface, whether someone's employment history surfaces accurately or not on social media is incredibly contextually and platform dependent, isn't it? On Twitter, where you're broadcasting, someone is unlikely to tweet, "I've lost my job." Okay? But they might have that conversation on Facebook with their friendship network to look for support. So the point is that there's something contextual about the platforms, isn't there? They determine the sorts of things that people talk about, and not necessarily how honest people are, but what they choose to surface and what they don't.
Well, one of the thoughts that I had when looking at this slide, again, the point that you have, I mean, you have consenting participants because you've got a survey. So that is different from the kind of social media research where people are just, downloading buckets of stuff and trying to sift through it. You've got that provides a certain structure, and that, as you say, the reporting piece that links it to an actual person. And so, one of the questions that I had was, do you think that the best kinds of online research combine, either they're mixed methods where you might have a quantitative piece and a qualitative piece, or a multimodal piece where you've got two of the same type, where, say, as a qualitative researcher, I might say, well, I'm going to use some creative methods, photo voice or something like that, and an interview, or
Yeah.
I'm going to read documents, diary methods, and have an interview, or I'm going to look at some big data to try to find out what the trends are around this topic, and then have an interview. So, with yours, where so do you think that really, some of the shortcomings that we can have from online research are remedied by having more than one method of data collection?
That's a good question. I'm gonna take the sneaky social science answer and say it depends.
Mhm.
I think one of the problems with research that is solely online is that we don't know who's talking. Now, a very simple example would be looking at discussion around any topic on Twitter and not knowing if you're dealing with a person or a bot.
Right.
And the bot problem is the bot problem is huge. Like it's genuinely a big deal. So the fact that you can link it to someone who you know exists
Mhm.
and is real is
Right.
very helpful. There's also the problem of double or triple counting. So people who have multiple accounts who talk about the same thing across multiple accounts get counted multiple times as separate individuals. So that can be a bit of
Mhm.
a misnomer there. But I don't think it's necessary for. I think it's outstanding research, and I also think it's very difficult to do. Very few people have the resources to do both, and that there's value in looking at it on its own. So there's quite a bit of work around trying to figure out sort of demographics of Twitter users based on Twitter data only. I've done a little bit about it myself. And you can what you can do is you can look at all the people tweeting in the UK, and you can look at, say, what I did was I had a survey. So I knew a probability survey, the proportion of tweeters based on some demographics, and just say, well, if I'm inferring this from Twitter based on some algorithms around, what names they're using, the sorts of terms they're talking about, and then I've got the survey that I know is right. Although I'm not linking between the survey, I can still compare the two and see if the profile of age, class, and gender looks about the same. And interestingly, what you find if you do that is that there are certain groups that appear to be underrepresented. So particularly occupational groups, people are seem less likely to talk about their occupation if it's what we might consider lower status, typically in the sort of occupational hierarchy. And they're more likely to talk perhaps about their hobbies. So someone isn't going to say that, that I don't know, that I work in a supermarket. They might instead say that they're a photographer because that's how they've chosen to present themselves, and that's what's important to them. Whereas if you're a lawyer or a barrister, then you're probably going to say that in your profile. So it's really complicated. And those sorts of, and of course on a survey, you would just say, what's your job? And you'd get accurate information from everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I mean about this idea about who's represented and who's not. And but if you don't do the linkage with the survey data or some kind of comparison, it can be very hard to know what's actually going on.
Right. But I would think that's your model here, could also translate, instead of survey in the place of the survey in this model, it could be interview, where it's also the reporting, it's also the personal interaction.
Absolutely.
But you do have a little bit more flexibility with most interview styles where, it could be, well, I saw that you were talking about your photography on Twitter, even though, your occupation is, working in the grocery store. Tell me about that. So you do have a little more flexibility, since it's not a, kind of an agreed upon form that you have in a survey, but would, so for people who are listening and trying to think, well, what can I do? But I think, the basic concept that I get from this is, the value of that immediate emerging data. And, in my stuff, one of my other models, I talk about the difference between, say, historical, especially for written documentary,
Yeah.
types of data, historical data before the internet that's been scanned and uploaded. Then what I call contemporary, where it's in the digital age, might, have both formats. And then emergent, where while we're here doing this webinar, 10 zillion things are being posted. It's, it's happening right now. And so, you have that, ability to get that up to the moment sense. What are people concerned about on this topic now? So, the value of being able to include some dimension of that immediacy together with something that allows you to actually identify an actual participant and know who you're talking to and get some of that, that kind of, whether it's the demographic information or some of those particulars that someone might not share on social media. I know that I don't, you wouldn't find out those things on my social media because I just don't talk about that stuff on social media. I don't talk about personal stuff. That's my choice.
Yes, and the immediacy is a really important point, Janet. That if some massive event happens and you want to survey people, how fast can you even get a telephone survey in the field? I mean, there are online panels now which are fast, but people's reactions on social media, self-elicited, are concurrent with the event.
Right.
And unless someone goes back and edits or modified whatever it is they created at the time, it's kind of a digital fossil for what they thought. And It's not necessarily impacted by hindsight, which a lot of retrospective accounts are.
Right.
That's a conceptual thing. And interestingly, it kind of relates to this. One of the most, if you want to talk about marrying together like traditional and new methods, I remember seeing a study once where some students at a house party had Bluetooth sensors enabled on their phone. They'd all signed up. It was all fine. And the Bluetooth sensor could tell you how close they were to each other. So it gave you a kind of network interaction pattern. And then you had an ethnographer at the party observing how people came in and out of friendship groups. And bringing those two things together is absolutely fascinating.
Right.
Imagine if you observed friendship groups in the workplace, and then you could see how people were corresponding on social media.
Right.
Because it would challenge some assumptions, wouldn't it? That assume that people who talk to each other a lot are close friends. Well, it might not be that. It might be the close friends, the ones that are not talking to each other very much, but it's a quality of conversation or the quantity thing. And that's where the two could really come together and answer some really interesting questions. I think there are a lot of things on social media that are taken for granted. So like volume of something, the number of times something comes up is often taken to be a proxy for salience.
Mm-hmm.
And it might not be. But I mean, we get that in qualitative work all the time, where if something comes up a lot, there's a real question about, yes, but is it important? It's coming up frequently. And you fall into the risk of counting the number of times a theme comes up, don't you? It's very easy to do.
Well, let's go with, we have one more. And so with this, I've tried to help people think through, particularly around informed consent, but that's not, the only way that you might think about this. But, if you're doing online research, where, how can we define public and private? And, I keep wiggling this around, because, sometimes I think there's more gray area, and sometimes I think, no, that's really obvious. So, for example, I mean, if we're, in the private online environment, like we are now, I mean, you have to log in. I know if I'm talking to you on Zoom, you log in, you and I are there, and we're having, I'm interviewing you. Well, that's obviously a private space. People can't just like drop in. But then in some of the other areas, what are the kinds of factors that would make you have to think? And as back in our NSMNSS days, I mean, one of the things that I did through that project was a whole study around thinking about ethics in online research and looking at how the different ethics codes were trying to provide guidance or were completely missing in action around those topics. The Association of Internet Researchers guidelines, which I've been, tangentially involved with. But, it seems like, more and more it's sort of saying like, well, you're going to have to figure this out. We can't really make rules about this because, there's so many variations. So, in looking at the couple of articles that you've published recently, and they are available through the link on MethodSpace if people want to look at them, you talked about the public and private dynamic and how it is different in some of the different platforms around the perceptions of the users. So in other words, we're not talking for that moment about something like we're meeting in Zoom where we've both logged in, that's pretty straightforward, but more into these, other kinds of spaces. So, do you think, is there more black and white or more gray? Or, would a researcher really need to kind of define these terms, for their particular study, depending on the platforms they're using?
Yeah, it's really grey, which is not the answer anyone wants to hear. Incidentally, that's why I think the AOIR guidance, the Association of Internet Research, is really good, because it doesn't tell you what to do. It asks you questions that you should consider. I think worry questions are a really good way to go with this. So I'll give you an example of why it's grey. So, when it's complicated, it's to do with, there's a cognitive dissonance, I think, between people who engage with social media and their expectations of privacy. So when you tweet something, it is a public broadcast. You've signed up to terms and conditions that, Twitter can do what they like with the data, they can monetize it, it is public. So the question is, if you put something in a public forum, do you have any right to private expectation to privacy? Now, if you look at this from an outsider perspective, like, well, no, it's in a public forum. You've said it. Can you withdraw it? Can you delete it? Well, that's interesting, particularly in Europe with GDPR, the right to censure, the right to removal. It gets quite complicated. What if it's already been collected? Well, it's quite hard to tell when things have been removed, actually. But regardless of all this, Twitter's an easy case because it's a public forum. But actually, our research shows that most people don't read the term. Lots of people don't read the terms and conditions. Right. We know that anyway. Right. Even those who are kind of aware that they exist and might even loosely be aware of what they're signing away, they would still expect, quite a few of them would still expect to be asked to be quoted in academic work if you were to quote a tweet. And it seems to matter whether you're like a charity or government or private sector or academia as well. So the intention of the researcher matters as well. Now, this is not something that users have signed away the right to decide on that, but it's still an expectation they have. And it fundamentally comes down to the question: what is our relationship with them? They're up very early on in the sort of when social media was coming to the fore. The data was there, it was public, it was fine. But there's been a move, like data are people, people are data. It's not quite that simple, because if they're participants or respondents, then that kind of specifies a very specific relationship between us and them. If it's just secondary archival data in the public domain, just like a media source, just like a comment piece in a newspaper, well, then that's slightly different. But
certainly, I mean, with some of those kinds of things, you think, well, APA or MLA, they have, you just cite it using the proper citation format. I mean, you can treat it like a published piece of writing. So, if someone, for example, if somebody were collecting, data from something that I've posted on LinkedIn or Twitter or even on MethodSpace, then I would expect them to to cite
Yeah.
it. It's my intellectual property, even though I have put it out there in the public. It's still, hey, give me credit for this. And so that, that is a slightly different twist too, where in some cases that is an easy solution. You say, well, I've referenced that person, but when you're collecting a bunch of data that you're going to now analyze, and then pull out quotes to illustrate things, that's a little bit different. And as we know, you can just plug those back into the search engine and find out, who would, well, that's Janet in Boulder. I mean, it's pretty obvious.
Yes, and with that in mind, Twitter are very clear. If you reproduce a tweet in work like the media, you'll see it all the time. When a tweet is included in a media article, it's embedded as an item. Twitter have very strict guidelines. You don't change it, you don't anonymize it, you attribute to the source. The problem is if you're dealing with a topic such as hate speech on social media, and you find someone that's done it, that could be illegal depending on the country they're in. And it gets complicated when we have protocols for dealing with people talking about illicit behavior, particularly for qualitative research and also for surveys. But what if it exists in social media? What do you do? Because there's no anonymity. In fact, the terms of service suggest that you can't anonymize it. It goes that the legal and the ethical kind of start to wrangle with each other, and it gets complicated.
Right. And that's, not something that illegal behavior is not something that I have in my list of things to consider here. But, would you say that point would go more on the side of saying, well, you would need to have informed consent if you're going to be using data from people about things that they're doing that are illegal? Or
I think you capture it.
I think in the US we've had a lot of interesting activity around people turning other people into the FBI based on their social media showing they were involved with some illegal activities. And so then that's a little bit of a different thing, but really how do you deal with posts by people that whether they're flagrantly bragging about doing illegal behavior, or it just comes up that they're smoking pot, or doing something, they're not shoplifting or something.
It's really complicated, really difficult, and sometimes you might come across this data not intending it. That's the point. On a survey you cannot ask sensitive questions. If you're collecting tweets containing a certain keyword or hashtag, you could get anything. So you've got to think about these things. It's Dana Boyd, I think, who talks a lot about the imagined audience. And it kind of goes back to this cognitive dissonance thing, that the potential audience, I think she did her work with teenagers, didn't she? So the potential audience when you're tweeting is global, but the individual doing the tweeting just assumes that no one's going to be interested. So there's a disconnect there. So by reproducing certain tweets, you can cause through the action of doing that, you can cause additional harm to your research participants. And whenever you talk about anything sensitive, so in one of the papers we did, there's a flow chart which is about whether to publish a tweet in your work or not, and like whether you need permission, whether you can have opt-in or opt-out. I mean, it's out there as our first offering for a possible way of negotiating this.
Well, maybe that's something we can post on MethodSpace in there.
And people can disagree with it, absolutely. But it was one of the first attempts to try and give some solid advice about how to proceed. But I know people that have done studies on not illegal things, but certainly contentious things, and they've messaged people to say, "Can I use your tweet in my work?" I say, "Yeah, of course you can," because they truly believe in the thing they've said. So people give permission for things time.
Well, I'm kind of thinking that with this model is specifically around guidance for informed consent, or at least
Yes.
food for thought for somebody to think through. Well, is it an obviously public or obviously private, or is it somewhere in between that I've got to figure this out? But it would seem to me that, based on kind of our conversation, it might be useful to make a different continuum, that it's not about informed consent. It's more about just, how can you use the source? What would be,
Yeah.
what are the questions around using a particular source that don't mean, because on one hand, with informed consent, the beauty of informed consent, even though a lot of people think, it's a pain in the neck, is that, I can ask you, in the consent negotiation, I can say to you, okay, I would like to, in addition to the survey or the interview where I'm asking you direct questions, I also want to observe your social media
That's it. Yeah.
posts. Are there topics that you want me to exclude? We can come to an agreement about how, what I'm going to include or not, and we can talk about it. Whereas if you're just doing an observation, if I'm wondering, how are people around the world responding to, particular event, and I'm just looking broad brush, I don't have that agreement, but then I still need to think through the ethics and just the respectful way of going about it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's also to do with it's not it's about what you do with the data. If you're going to aggregate it all into some quantitative model, then there's no risk of disclosure from the individual being identified at the end of it through a published output.
Right.
But I think qualitative researchers have the hardest, because obviously you want to present examples of what you've done. In the past, I've seen this dealt with in different ways. Sometimes people take a bricolage approach, so they'll create an artificial tweet to kind of show what they were getting at, or they might use their own Twitter profile to provide an example, for instance. That satisfies some people and not others, but it is tricky. But the fact that it's tricky doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. That my message all the time is that we need to find ways to do this, because whilst we're governed by ethical frameworks, there are lots of other people and companies, organizations that aren't and don't care and are doing it anyway. So if we withdraw from it because it's too difficult, then we lose our seat at the table to challenge some of the other stuff that's going on in the private sector.
Excellent point. So I think with that, why don't we open it up and see what, Michael, what kind of questions?
So we've got about 7 minutes and we've got about 7,000 questions. So I'm going to condense to one large thread that started with how do I deal with my institutional review board for some of these things, which it's a big issue, but then there's people that have approval from their institutional review boards and are still have concerns because they don't want to hurt people. So I'm going to a two-pronged question. How do I deal with my IIRB, both for fundamental questions and then also for issues of timeliness? And then two, what are some just basic missteps that researchers have made, or what are some areas that people have breached the ethics wall but wanted to be good actors but weren't?
Okay, so the IRB stuff, I mean, it's tricky because it depends where you are in the world. It also depends on the discipline. So some disciplines are more concerned with this, others, some would just consider it public data. I think there's a job of education to be done with IRBs. They're there to protect us, they're there to protect participants. If you can enter into a dialogue about your research with them, that's really helpful. And that's hard sometimes when you're filling in a form, because you get a question like, is your research going to contain vulnerable participants? I get this in my dissertation students all the time if they're doing social media work. I'm like, well, maybe, you're not recruiting, you're not screening for it. Is your research going to contain under 18s? Yeah, maybe, but I've got no way of telling. So it's about communicating the nuances of these things and explaining to IRBs that you are not being remiss in the difficulties of answering these questions. These truly reflect the ethical complexities of the research.
Right. Well, what I recommend to people is that, they look at, so thinking, in this holistic way that I've described in this framework, aligning your purpose and design is a really strong piece of this. So, rather than just kind of throwing in, the technology piece like somewhere down the line, explain that, from the beginning, how, you know, is this a medium? What is it what about the technology fits into this design and how are you dealing with it? Around, all of these issues. So it's not just, informed consent or not, vulnerable or not. There are ethical dimensions in all of these areas. Are you an insider or an outsider? What's your position? How are you going to deal with your own biases or your own preconceived notions? Explain your research design and look for, I mean, at this point, it's a lot easier than it was when Luke and I were starting out, and there wasn't any published literature. When I was doing my original research, there was no published literature where people used online methods. So I was just like, hey, I'm making it up as I go along, but just believe me, I'm going to do a good job. Whereas now, there's lots of literature out there. So, I say, look at your research design, explain it from that very beginning perspective, the methodology, the methods, the epistemological positions, tie it in, everywhere, not just, oh, and by the way, I'm collecting data online, somewhere down the road. And then, look at the literature, there really, there are lots out there, and we can give a plug that this is the focus we will be working on the entire month of June on method space. So, if you want to learn about this, follow us in June, and we'll be having a lot of material on this topic, and excellent, reputable, experienced research perspectives.
Yeah, and in relation to the second question, Michael, about not mistakes that people have been made, but I think it's I think we know now that there's no way social media data can be anonymous. Okay, I think the idea of anonymizing a quote is I mean, I don't know of any studies that have got wrong, but I just kind of sense the idea that even if someone were to decide to anonymize a tweet, even though technically they shouldn't, you can never really anonymize it because it's so searchable, it's so well indexed. So I think there's a more growing awareness around that. There's some quite complicated questions about right to withdrawal. So what if someone deletes a tweet and it's in your work, things like that. But these are not new debates. Like, there's always been the opportunity for someone to withdraw their interview transcript or their survey. This is not, so it's just about applying some of the principles that we had in a new context, I think, and adapting them.
I would, I know we don't have a lot of time, but the very thumbnail sketch of one student I was aware of at the university where I used to teach, who had complete approval for the study, but the people who were doing the approval, in other words, the things that I would go like, oh no, do not do that. They thought, looks good to me. And, if I say no, I'm going to look like this real, Luddite square. So I'm thinking like, cool, go for it. And, as you're saying, they need education too. So on one hand, I would say, like, don't entirely rely on, like, the fact that they're going to, give you the thumbs up doesn't necessarily mean like problem solved, because this student she was going into a closed discussion group, and she'd gotten permission from the moderator, but she didn't tell the participants in the group that she was a researcher. So she was there lurking, and they found out she was a researcher, and they were not happy about it, threw her out of the group, and she had to start completely from scratch and go back and do a whole nother research proposal. So I just say, yeah, you need to get approval. That's only one step in the ethics process, but don't necessarily rely on that to be, the absolute benchmark for for how you should proceed. And again, we will be sharing, lots of ethics research sources on a method space during the month of June as we discuss this topic in more depth.
Yeah, I want to thank you, Janet, and I want to thank you, Luke, for being here today. To the audience, this will be recorded. This has been recorded. It will appear at methodspace.com. You can see that there. Many of the questions that you've asked we'll attempt to answer in writing at methodspace.com, and we'll also have some of the resources that kind of flash by, the Edwards citation, the website for AOIR, all these different things that have kind of like zipped by. We'll gather some of those and have them there. And we thank you all for being here, and we wish you a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.